Americans must not be used as scapegoats in times of crisis. Lives are at stake, and it's critical that Congress takes bold action to address this pandemic of discrimination and hate.
Good morning, I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for The Washington Post. Welcome to Washington Post Live and another installment of our series on race in America. Today, combating anti-Asian racism is our focus. Congresswoman Judy Chu is chair of the House Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. She is the first Chinese American woman to serve in Congress. And joining her is Congressman Mark Takano. He is the caucus's second vice chair, and he is the first out-gay person of color to be elected to Congress. They both represent districts in California, and they join me now. Congresspersons, thank you very much for being here.
My pleasure.
Thank you for having us.
So, Congresswoman Chu, I'll start with you and dive right into what Washington could do. What legislation would you like Congress to pass to combat the rising tide of anti-Asian racism and discrimination?
Well, we are pushing for two laws to be passed, the No Hate Act and the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act. The COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act would designate a person in the Department of Justice to track the progress of hate crimes as they go through the system and work to make sure that there are prosecutions. It would also issue guidelines to law enforcement agencies on being able to report on hate crimes as well as be sensitive to multilingual necessities in those communities that need it and need it to report hate crimes. The No Hate Act has actually been passed out of the House twice, last fall in the HEROES Act and the updated HEROES Act. It would revamp our hate crimes laws, which are very deficient right now. A 1990 federal law said that the FBI was supposed to be reporting on hate crimes, but they can only rely on voluntary submission of hate crime data from local law enforcement. Most of them don't do it. In fact, 18 states don't have any mandate to report hate crimes. 3 states don't even have a hate crime statute. This bill would change the reporting. It would also provide grants to local law enforcement to enact a hate crime program and have training. It would provide oversight by the U.S. Attorney General, who would look at the state of hate crime reporting and hate crime prosecutions in the United States on a yearly basis.
Congresswoman, is there bipartisan support for both or either of these bills?
There is for the No Hate Act, and in fact, we have taken great pains to make sure it is bipartisan. It is actually being reintroduced this week with 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans as the lead, and in fact, I'm one of those 2 Democrats. And when it was in the law passed out this past fall, there were 103 co-sponsors, and 15 of them were Republican. So we do have hopes that this will indeed be able to pass the Senate and then be signed into law.
Congressman Takano, to focus on the local and state level, what would you like to see authorities at the local and state level do to protect AAPI communities and businesses? You know, we had a story, there was a story a while back talking about how AAPI businesses and business owners were hiring their own security, buying guns, cutting their hours of operation, and even their advertising as a way of protecting themselves.
Well, that certainly was occurring at the beginning of the pandemic when many people were associating the pandemic with Asian Americans and Asian American businesses. Speaker Pelosi famously went specifically to Chinatown to try, in her own district in San Francisco, to try to push back against those sentiments. What I would like to see is more outreach to not only enhanced reporting and encouraging of local law enforcement agencies to actually do reporting, but a standardization of that reporting. And the two bills that Congresswoman Chu just mentioned would enable that to happen. But there needs to be outreach specifically to AAPI communities because they're diverse, they have slightly different cultures, different languages. But I think what is shared among AAPI ethnicities in general is a hesitancy or a lack of knowledge and a lack of connection to some of these law enforcement agencies, a lack of built-in trust and relationships with many of these law enforcement agencies. And that will take some outreach, some very specific outreach, and it'll take education of these communities. It's going to take nonprofit organizations and human service organizations within these communities to also be empowered to teach the communities on how to build those relationships with local law enforcement.
Congresswoman Chu, what specific actions would you like to see from the Biden administration, from President Biden and the Justice Department?
Well, there has been a sea change with regard to how the administration has treated this from the times of Donald Trump. And let me just say for context that for a whole year, we have been speaking out about the anti-Asian hate crimes, which were stoked by the xenophobia of Donald Trump, who kept on using the terms China virus, Wuhan virus, and even Kung flu. Despite the fact that the CDC and the World Health Organization said to not use such terms because of the stigma that it would cause from people from those geographic locations and also that ethnicity. Despite that, he actually doubled down and, in fact, encouraged his Republican followers to use that same rhetoric. Hence, it was even more inflamed. But I tell you, when President Biden took office, I was just so gratified because within the first week of his taking office, he issued that executive memorandum, which condemned the anti-Asian hate crimes and also directed his Department of Justice to meet with the AAPI community. In fact, we jumped on it right away, and we actually have already met with them. We've talked about the programs that they're thinking about. We also are putting in a request to meet with U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland. But President Biden went beyond that. He talked about this issue and condemned anti-Asian hatred in his first primetime address. He also went to visit the AAPI community of Atlanta, Georgia, and he also had flags flown at half staff for the victims, which was so touching to me to drive by those flags and see them at half mast. I just couldn't even imagine it before.
And yet, despite that, Congressman Takano, well, the White House agreed late on Tuesday to add a senior level Asian American Pacific Islander liaison after Senators Tammy Baldwin and I'm sorry, not Tammy Baldwin, Senator Tammy Duckworth and Senator Mazie Hirono threatened to only vote for non-white or LGBTQ nominees due to insufficient AAPI representation in the president's cabinet. What role should this liaison play? And are there any individuals you'd like to see considered? And then on top of that question, what do you make of this liaison role? Is that enough?
Well, I've long made my views known about my disappointment that President Biden did not appoint an AAPI person to one of the top secretary, I think it's 15 or 16 cabinet positions with the title of secretary. The administration has talked about cabinet level appointees, but that's not really the same thing, I think, in the eyes of many of us who are AAPIs on the Hill. That being said, those positions have been filled. That part of the cabinet has been set. I will say that it made a big difference to have Secretary of Transportation Mineta in a Republican administration. His perspective, I think, really made a difference in terms of how the second Bush administration dealt with rising Islamophobia. And President Bush himself, former President George W. Bush himself, said what a difference that Norm Mineta made in making his views known. That's an example of what inclusion of AAPIs at the very top level means. But that being said, I view this position, this liaison position in the West Wing, as significant. And I think Senator Hirono and Senator Duckworth were, I think, reassured by the fact that was going to happen. I think that we need a point person who can bring the AAPI voice to the very top level on a day-to-day basis to sensitize the administration to what is going on in the community. My colleague Judy Chu is much closer to this than I am, so I defer to her. She's been on this negotiations on a day-to-day basis.
And in fact, I was going to go to Congresswoman Chu with a follow-up on this, and to get to what Congressman Takano was talking about in terms of secretary versus cabinet level, and as you well know, and I'm sure a lot of folks in the audience know, that USTR, the United States Trade Representative Tai, is AAPI. The former nominee, Neera Tanden, the nominee for OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, is also AAPI. For those who are wondering why having someone from the community in those two positions at a cabinet level, why does that not count from your perspective? And then on top of that, who would you like to see to be considered for those high-level positions within the administration?
So for the last 20 years, there has been an AAPI that has served as a cabinet secretary in both Democratic and Republican administrations. In this administration, every single constituency group is represented amongst the 15 cabinet secretaries, and that is Black, Hispanic, Native American, LGBT, women, but not AAPIs. And so that leads us to believe that we are in a second-class citizen position. We do have gratitude for the cabinet level positions. Actually, now it's even only one right there, which is Catherine Tai. So, I think the frustration that you see coming out of Senator Duckworth and Hirono is not only on this cabinet level position, but the fact that now we even only have one cabinet level position now that Neera Tanden's nomination has been withdrawn. So we know that the cabinet secretary positions have been filled. We are pushing for as many AAPIs to be in the high level positions as possible. That being said, we are pushing for Nani Coloretti to be nominated as the director of the Office of Management and Budget. She's very, very well qualified and certainly would increase the representation of AAPIs in the entire cabinet, which consists of 24 people.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the shootings in Atlanta, the tragic shootings in Atlanta. Prosecuting hate crimes laws, law enforcement. Prosecuting hate crimes requires law enforcement to find proof that the incidents are racially motivated. Congresswoman Chu, and then Congressman Takano, do you believe there is proof to pursue hate crimes for the shootings in Atlanta?
So let's look at what this shooter did. This 21-year-old white male picked a business for his first victim called Young's Asian Massage and shot 4 victims there, then drove 27 miles to a location with two Asian spa businesses side by side and shot into those businesses, he had lots of choices along the way if the issue was sex addiction. But no, he specifically chose three Asian businesses where clearly, if he shot into them, he would kill Asian women. I would say that there has to be as many resources as possible to prove the hate crime. And actually, whether law enforcement uses those resources to the greatest degree possible to look for those clues that would support a hate crime statute and charge depends on the level of commitment of law enforcement to it. That's why we're actually pushing for the Department of Justice to also come in and use its resources to ensure that every stone is unturned. And by the way, a number of these witnesses probably speak other languages like Korean. Are they really interviewing all the Korean witnesses? Are they looking at the Korean newspapers, which actually had some statements that they said were made by other witnesses who heard him say something that was racial? Every stone needs to be unturned.
Congressman Takano, I'd love your thoughts on this, but also as a result of the shootings in Atlanta, just sort of akin to what happened after the killing of George Floyd, there were nationwide protests where the mantra is stop Asian hate. Do you see this as an inflection point for the AAPI community? And if so, what do you want to see next?
So Jonathan, I do see it as an inflection point. I think there's been I don't know if it's called a simmering or a bubbling up of frustration across the various AAPI ethnicities. We've been, I think, gritting our teeth all through this pandemic at the way in which the President of the United States, Donald Trump, and the complicity of top Republican leaders allowed Asian AAPIs in this country to be stigmatized. So I do see it as an inflection point. We felt all along that something terrible could happen from this stigmatization. We have memories of Vincent Chin, a Chinese American, in the I think 70s or 80s in Detroit, who out of work auto workers who blamed Japan for their unemployment took out their anger on Vincent Chin, and then the Asian American community watched as the perpetrators, the murderers, got away with very light sentences. And so we know what a generalized mass blame stigmatization can mean for the AAPI community as a whole, even though we may not be of a certain ethnicity. In this case, Vincent Chin was mistaken for a Japanese American, a Chinese American mistaken for a Japanese American, but it didn't matter. And we knew that something like this could happen. And hate crimes are to prove a hate crime is a very high bar. And Congressman Chu is right to point out: is law enforcement prepared to deal with the language diversity of the victims in this case? Are they going to turn over every stone? And to Asian Americans, I think, and even reasonable observers of what happened down there, 6 Asian businesses were the loci of these crimes. 6 out of the 8 victims were AAPI women. If it doesn't even meet the technicalities of what it means to be a hate crime, it certainly was a crime of hate. And multiple Asian American and women immigrants were the victims, and so it's a crime of hate at the very least.
Well, Congressman Takano, I'm going to stick with you here because you were talking before about the history of hatred and discrimination against the AAPI community. Your father still has scars on his legs from internment, and I understand your great uncle was among the many Japanese Americans who died fighting for this country in World War II. What does your family's history tell us about how Asian Americans have been scapegoated throughout American history?
Well, it's often not understood that from the very beginning of the Republic, there were proscriptions against AAPI immigrants from even being able to naturalize as citizens. You couldn't become a naturalized citizen if you were an immigrant from Asia. And that certainly was true for my grandfather, my one immigrant grandfather, who arrived on these shores around 1916. He couldn't buy property. There were alien land laws, which specifically targeted him. There were the Chinese Exclusion Act, which just forbade any immigration from China, and there was the Japanese Exclusion Act. So even predating World War II, back to the late 19th century and the early 20th century, this was the situation. My grandfather bought land in the name of my grandmother, who was American-born, and they would lose that land because they couldn't work that land during the war while they were interned. And he took me there when I was a 10-year-old boy on my first plane trip to Bellevue, Washington, where he owned this property. And on that property then was a Holiday Inn. And so you can see the intergenerational interruption of the wealth building. My father, well, there wasn't a really great OSHA that existed back in the days when they built these camps. And my father was, 3 or 4 years old with another young boy playing around these incineration pits that they used to burn the trash. There were thousands and thousands of people in these camps. And he and the other young boy fell in. I heard that the other boy perished. My father was able to climb out. And I remember my schoolmates would notice when my father wore shorts that they would look at the discolored shins of my father. And I was a bit embarrassed as a youngster to kind of explain to them, well, how he got those scars. And they were quite extensive over his shins.
You talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act, and we have an audience question from Karen Tanabe, and she asks, how do we get schools to teach more about the history of anti-Asian violence like the Chinese Exclusion Act and Japanese internment camps? I'll give that to you real quickly, Congressman Takano.
Well, very quickly, I'll say that, the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which had the government formally apologize to those who were interned during World War II, and compensated them. Those who were still living, people like my grandfather, didn't receive that compensation, but also provided for an education fund. Well, we need to make sure that that education fund is robustly funded, and that schools are encouraged to use the resources of that fund to be able to teach the lessons of this, the ironies of people like my great Uncle Mon, who fought for our country even as his relatives were interned. Remarkable resemblance to the many African Americans who fought for this country in our great conflicts and came home to face continued discrimination, even violent death, as they returned back from World War II. And I, as chairman of the Veterans Affairs Committee, I hope to highlight the contributions of those segregated fighting units who made such a difference, but yet who could not use the GI Bill and who could not use the Veterans Home Loan and build that same intergenerational wealth that I kind of alluded to that was interrupted also in the case of my own grandfather.
Congresswoman Chu, in the time that we have left, I want to draw attention to something that you called for, which is happening today. You called for March 26th to be a national day to speak out against anti-Asian hate. So as we close, what message do you want America, or what message do you want to send to America today?
I would like to ask everybody to participate in this National Day of Action and Healing to speak out against Asian hate. Everybody can do it from their home, or they can join a rally. We ask that they do a tweet, a post, a virtual conversation, an in-person event, and then stream that on the hashtag Stop Asian Hate. And you can find out more information on how to participate on www.asianamericandayofAction.com. What we wanted with this is to have an echo across all of the United States that people are standing up against this hate, that they want us to come together and join forces and be able to welcome everybody of every ethnic background to this country. So please be a participant in this Speak Out. Actually, already there have been so many rallies, so many events just over the past few days, and there are quite a few for today from coast to coast in every state. And we hope that this is indeed a wake-up call to Asian Americans and actually to the nation, that this must stop, that we can all do our part. And we're also putting out the message that if you are AAPI and you are the victim of a hate crime or hate incident, please report it on the Stop AAPI website. It's important for you to make sure that it is dealt with and there are resources there. But if you're a bystander, if you witness such a thing, there are things that you can do. In fact, there's bystander intervention training in which you can learn the 5 Ds, which are such things as document, pull out the iPhone if you see an incident like this, and record it, because that is sometimes how the perpetrator can be caught. But there are all kinds of interventions that you can do to stop this kind of hateful action. But the most important thing is for people to come together, to understand where all of this is coming from, to not believe these kinds of myths that are out there with regard to Asians somehow bringing the coronavirus, that people understand that everybody is a part of this country and, in fact, work together to build this country, and that we will not become a United States of America as we know it unless we do come together.
And Congressman Takano, actually, I will end with you just to add on to what Congresswoman Chu was just saying, to the point of imploring people to report incidents. Understandably, there's a lot of fear when you're a victim of harassment, discrimination, violence, or crime to take your concerns to law enforcement. What would you say to anyone who may have been a victim, or if they become a victim and are fearful of coming forward to law enforcement to get it documented? What would you say to them to get them to put those fears and concerns into action?
Well, I would say that that many AAPIs are culturally disposed to keeping their heads down, but I would encourage all Asian American Pacific Islanders to make that call to the police. If you're concerned about reaching the police, there are maybe many AAPI organizations that you can also work through. Your members of Congress are also resources. They have caseworkers, and they can often help make that connection to the local police. So don't be afraid to or hesitate to call on your member of Congress, and we can also try to make that connection to local law enforcement.
And with that, we're going to have to end this discussion. Congresswoman Judy Chu, Congressman Mark Takano, we're out of time, but this isn't the end of this important conversation. We will stay focused on this. Thank you both very much for coming to Washington Post Live.
Great to be here, Jonathan.
Thank you.
And as always, thank you for tuning in. On Tuesday at 10 a.m., Eastern Time. Join my colleague Robin Gavon for the first conversation in a new series called Opportunity in Crisis. This conversation will be with Congresswoman Marilyn Strickland, former HUD Secretary Julian Castro, and the president of the Ford Foundation, Darren Walker. They'll discuss how the past year has exposed some of our country's deepest inequities and how we can reimagine a more just society. Once again, I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for the Washington Post. Thank you very much for watching Washington Post Live.